In this video, I'm going to be discussing a 12 vintage vertical tasting of Ducru-Beaucaillou that my tasting group recently conducted, as well as 8 takeaways from that tasting for wine collectors. While these takeaways will certainly be beneficial for Ducru-Beaucaillou collectors, they also have broader application to those who like Bordeaux more generally. For example, not a week goes by when someone doesn't ask me for my thoughts regarding the best Bordeaux vintages for current consumption, those Bordeaux vintages that offer the best values, and for some decanting or aeration advice regarding some of the more structured Bordeaux vintages. So these are just some examples of more broader applications that I'll be discussing in this video. But first, a quick overview of Ducru-Beaucaillou. Ducru-Beaucaillou is a second growth in the 1855 classification of Bordeaux, but it's also widely regarded as a so-called super second. And so this means that in some strong vintages, its wines can rival the quality of that of the first growths. Also, it means that these wines sell at a slight premium to many of the other second growth Bordeauxs that are available in the market. Ducru-Beaucaillou is located in Saint-Julien on Bordeaux's left bank. It has 75 hectares of vineyards that are planted to 70% Cabernet Sauvignon and 30% Merlot. It does not use Petit Verdot or Cabernet Franc in its blends, and in fact, they even removed the Petit Verdot that they had so that they could increase the percentages of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. This is a consistently outstanding producer, and that was definitely one of the catalysts for us having a tasting regarding Ducru-Beaucaillou. We were able to assemble 12 outstanding vintages of Ducru-Beaucaillou, and we tried to get the best vintages that we could from the time period 1982 through 2005. We divided these 12 wines into 2 flights so that it would be a little bit more manageable. The oldest vintages were in the first flight, and so the first flight included 1982, 1985, 1986, 1988, 89, and 1990. The second flight of wines included the 1995 and 1996 vintages, as well as 1999, 2000, 2001, and 2005. There were 8 of us that were participating in this tasting, and we acquired all these wines in the secondary market, with each of us paying 1/8 of the total cost. With that by way of background, I'm ready to reveal my 8 takeaways for wine collectors. The first takeaway is that the younger wines generally outclassed the older vintages. Certainly the 1982 had a very strong showing in the first flight, and the 2005 was a bit of an outlier on the downside in the second flight. But despite the fact that most of us in this tasting group prefer the older vintages, we were very surprised that the second flight generally outclassed the first flight, and that was definitely unanimous in this group. I've been giving this point a lot of thought since the time of the tasting, and I think that the most reasonable explanation for it is the fact that most producers in Bordeaux, including Ducru-Beaucaillou, implemented a much more strict selection of fruit for their top wine beginning around the 1995 to 2000 time period. And so certainly a lot of the fruit that used to go into the top wine back in the 1980s is no longer included in the top wine, but instead will go into either the second wine or the third wine. And for that reason, it definitely seemed like most of the wines in the second flight were a notch above the wines in the first flight. The second takeaway for wine collectors from the 12 vintage vertical tasting of Ducru-Beaucaillou that we recently conducted was that the structured vintages definitely benefited from an extended decant prior to the time that the tasting began. One of our concerns was that some of the structured wines, namely the 1986 and the 1995, may not show their best if we just gave every wine a pop and pour and opened them at the same time. And so for that reason, we opened the 1986 and the 1995 at least an hour before they were tasted. And this paid off handsomely, as those wines had a very strong showing in this tasting, and were definitely showing their best with that additional airtime. We also gave the 2000 and 2005 vintages a bit of a head start, but they didn't require quite as much air as the 1986 and the 1995. The next takeaway for wine collectors from the 12 vintage vertical tasting of Ducru-Beaucaillou is that the 1996 vintage continues to show extremely well. I'm a huge fan of the 1996 vintage in Bordeaux generally. It's definitely much more enjoyable for the most part than the 1995 vintage, which can be a little bit austere and structured. In contrast, the 1996 wines that I've tasted recently have certainly been much more enjoyable and generous and fruit-forward than the 1995s. They also open up much more quickly. And certainly the 1996 Ducru had a very strong showing in this tasting, and despite the very formidable competition, it finished in the top 3. So definitely a very impressive wine, and one that I would highly recommend if you're able to find it for an attractive price in the secondary market. The next takeaway for wine collectors from the 12 vintage Ducru-Beaucaillou vertical tasting that we recently conducted is that there were no flawed bottles out of the 12. So certainly that's extremely impressive given the fact that all these wines were purchased in the secondary market and have substantial bottle aging. It did probably help that 3 of the bottles were ex-Chateau and were probably reconditioned and topped off at the winery. But nevertheless, to have 9 bottles, including many from the 80s and 90s, all that were showing extremely well and which were not reconditioned or ex-Chateau bottlings, is certainly very impressive and certainly bodes well for Ducru-Beaucaillou and for wine collectors who want to purchase this excellent producer's wines in the secondary market. Just to give you a frame of reference, about a month before, we did a comparable tasting of very high-quality Bordeaux from the 80s and 90s, and we had a tasting that included about 10 wines total. All of them were exceptional wines, but unfortunately 2 of them were flawed. One was corked and one suffered from heat damage. So both were very disappointing losses, and that was maybe an 80% success rate, which is more comparable to what you'd expect for this sort of a tasting. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. The next takeaway for wine collectors from the 12 vintage vertical tasting of Ducru-Beaucaillou is the relative underperformance from 3 vintages of the century. Of course, in Bordeaux, there's vintages of the century at least 3 times a decade, but in this Ducru tasting, there was relative underperformance from 3 of the 5 vintages of the century. The 1989 and the 1990 Ducru, for example, finished 5th and 6th in the first flight. So what that means is even the 1985, 86, and 88 Ducru outperformed the 1989 and the 1990. This certainly is a bit of an outlier when compared to some other producers in 1989 and 1990, because those vintages were generally extremely strong in Bordeaux, and also vintages that show remarkably well right now. And in fact, the 1990 vintage may very well be my favorite vintage for current consumption of Bordeaux, and there's many outstanding historic Bordeauxs that were made that vintage. Likewise, in the second flight, there was another vintage of the century for Ducru that underperformed, and that was the highly acclaimed 2005 vintage. I had the 2005 last in the first flight, as well as last out of the 12 wines overall. So certainly, given its high pedigree, that's not a very strong performance for that wine. Of course, I do think it's important to note that these wines were definitely not flawed, and they were very enjoyable wines. It's just that they were not as enjoyable as the other vintages of Ducru, and they were definitely not standouts that were worthy of paying a price premium. The next takeaway for wine collectors from the 12 vintage vertical tasting of Ducru-Beaucaillou is that the legendary 1982 was not the winner. This was definitely a surprise to me, as I've had this wine several times in the past year or so, and it's always showed extremely well. And in fact, in 2022, this wine finished as my number 11 wine that I enjoyed for the entire year. So certainly an exceptional wine, and this wine was definitely on point and showing well. It's just that there was another wine that was even better, which I'll be discussing in just a moment. With respect to 1982 Bordeaux, I think it's important to note that many of those wines, particularly in standard size bottles, are getting a little bit long in the tooth and past prime. What makes this wine so special, however, is that Ducru did a library release a few years ago, which means that they were stored in pristine conditions at the winery and tested and perhaps even topped off and recorked before they were sent into the market. And so definitely, if you're a collector and you're looking to buy 1982 Ducru, be sure to keep an eye out for these ex-Chateau bottlings, which you can tell by the bright orange vibrant labels that they have on them. The 3 vintages of Ducru-Beaucaillou from this tasting that I think are the best value is the next takeaway for wine collectors from the 12 vintage vertical tasting of Ducru-Beaucaillou that we recently conducted. In the first flight, the 1988 was definitely the best value. While it was not overly complex, the 1988 Ducru was still showing extremely well and was very delightful and enjoyable to drink. Likewise, in the second flight, the 1999 and the 2001 vintages were definitely the best values. These wines were by no means the most expensive wines out of the bunch, and yet they were showing extraordinarily well. While they didn't reach the heights of some of the top wines or make the top 3, they were definitely extremely solid wines and wines that I'd be more than happy to enjoy pretty much any day of the year. So definitely keep an eye out for the 1999 and 2001 vintages and 1988 if you can find one that's been stored in pristine conditions. With respect to the 1999 and 2001 vintage recommendations, this is a suggestion that applies pretty much across the board in Bordeaux and not just to Ducru-Beaucaillou. The next takeaway for wine collectors arising out of the 12 vintage vertical tasting of Ducru-Beaucaillou is the wine of the night. As mentioned, it was the 1982 Ducru that was the winner of the first flight. In the second flight, it was the 2000 Ducru that got the nod and certainly the most votes. It was a little bit difficult to compare these wines because they were tasted in separate flights, but fortunately we saved a little bit of the 1982 Ducru so that we could do a comparison tasting with the winner of the second flight. So I was able to do a direct comparison tasting between the 1982 and 2000 Ducru. This was certainly extremely close, and when I tasted them separately, my assumption was that the 1982 would win and that it was probably ahead a little bit. But when I compared them, it turned out that the 2000 Ducru had a slightly longer finish and a bit more concentration. But certainly both wines were absolutely phenomenal, and the differences between these two excellent wines were quite subtle, and it took me some concentrated effort to be able to identify the winner. If, like me, you're a huge fan of Bordeaux, please be sure to check out my playlist in the pinned comment below.